I welcome you all to this webinar on cross-border insolvency case analysis. We have total 335 registrations today for this webinar. Attendees will only be on audio option. Questions can be asked by the participants in the chat box, which is there on the right-hand side of the screen. So let me have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Risham Garg, sir, who is an Assistant Professor of Law and Research Director, Center for Transnational Commercial Law. Dr. Garg holds a doctoral research degree for his work on international contracts. He presently teaches courses of bankruptcy, insolvency, and restructuring laws, laws of contracts, and other commercial laws in the postgraduate and undergraduate law degree program. Now, I would request sir to take the session and impart his valuable knowledge to all the attendees. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, ICSI IIP, for inviting me for this program. So, I invite you all and for joining this. The topic of my deliberation today is cross-border insolvency, and my discussion would be on certain cases. So, analysis of a few cases relating to the cross-border insolvency. So what I have tried to do is I have taken cases from India and certain cases which are considered to be leading cases and of great importance in international insolvency. So to start the program, what do you feel and what do we understand about cross-border insolvency, and why is cross-border insolvency relevant for today, and why should we be so interested in cross-border insolvency? So cross-border insolvency is a necessity to deal with insolvent debtors with assets over several jurisdictions. It aids with the insolvency process for several Indian multinational with subsidiaries and assets in foreign jurisdictions and undergoing insolvency process in other countries. This is also essential to improve credit recovery rate, information exchange without delay, empowering insolvency representatives, and remedy in foreign jurisdictions. So that is why we need cross-border insolvency. The insolvency resolution mechanism, and when insolvency professionals are assigned cases, they certainly are faced with issues of foreign assets, offshore assets, and how they can be recovered and how to involve them in the recovery process or the resolution process. So what is the need for a law on cross-border insolvency? The UNCITRAL model law on cross-border insolvency has been issued by UNCITRAL to assist states in relation to the regulation of corporate insolvency. And the model law has been widely recognized and adopted by more than 44 countries, including the leading countries, the legal systems. Ministry of Corporate Affairs had also released a draft chapter on cross-border insolvency, which was based upon the UNCITRAL model law. The salient aspects of the draft issued by the MCA, it includes key features which nearly replicate those in the UNCITRAL model law. There is applicability to corporate debtor in relation to foreign insolvency proceedings. So basically, the first question that anybody would ask is that whether they will be applicable to a corporate debtor. Yes, they will be applicable to a corporate debtor in relation to foreign insolvency proceedings. Indian insolvency proceedings and concurrent insolvency proceedings, and foreign creditors having interest in commencement of Indian insolvency proceedings where assistance is sought in a state by a foreign court. There is also provision for creditors in a foreign state on equal footing with domestic creditors, recognized rights of foreign representatives, recognition of foreign proceedings in relation to corporate debtor, and also the recognition of orders. So what you also need is that the NCLT orders be recognized and be able to enforce outside. Similarly, the foreign insolvency orders be recognized and be able to be enforced in India. Now we start with the recent examples of cross-border insolvency in India. So we have two major cases. One is the case of Jet Airways, and the second is the case of Videocon. So Jet Airways became the first Indian company to undergo a cross-border insolvency proceeding. Now, what happened in the Jet case? So in the case of Jet Airways, initially there was a creditor in Netherlands, and they issued procedure. They issued proceedings, and those proceedings were basically to take possession of the assets, which were the airlines, the aircraft, and those are also so those were in fact the insolvency proceedings where the foreign creditor, that is the Dutch creditor, filed insolvency application in the Dutch court. So the Dutch court recognized those, admitted that insolvency application, and when that insolvency application was admitted, the Dutch insolvency professional came to India, to the NCLT Mumbai, because that was where the head office of Jet was located. And then they sought to get the Dutch insolvency order recognized and enforced in India. Now, when this went to the NCLT Mumbai, the NCLT Mumbai said, we don't have any such provision to recognize any cross-border insolvency proceeding under the IBC. There were just those two provisions, and which were based upon agreement or protocol. So NCLT Mumbai did not agree to it, and dismissed that application. Now appeal was made to the NCLAT, and in NCLAT, the so what so we must also know some interesting aspects, that at the time the Dutch insolvency application was moved in the NCLT Mumbai, that is for the recognition and enforcement of the Dutch insolvency proceedings. Till that time, no insolvency application against Jet had been filed by any creditor, any lender in India. And subsequently, SBI bankers filed insolvency application against Jet under Section 7 of IBC. So by the time this matter reached the NCLAT, insolvency proceedings had already commenced in India, and then the NCLAT issued a relief to the Dutch insolvency professional that they can participate in the committee of creditors, which was to be constituted pursuant to the insolvency application filed by bankers, financial creditors in India. So, issue, if we can say, if there are parallel insolvency proceedings in Netherlands and India, they were likely to lead to conflicts with respect to the assets of Jet Airways, and difficult for foreign creditors to seek recognition of order of Netherlands court in India. So, so now the situation was that Netherlands court had initiated insolvency proceedings against Jet, although it was a subsidiary of Jet, and it was an office, so it was against Jet only. It was an office of Jet, and in India also there was insolvency proceedings. So there can be a difficulty when there are parallel insolvency proceedings. But considering the international or the norms, the international insolvency norms, and how to resolve such situations. Uh, there are a few principles, notably one amongst them is that there needs to be a center of main interests. And wherever is the center of main interests of a company, only in that particular place, the main proceeding in respect of cross-border insolvency can continue. and main proceeding can only be one. So a company may have assets, may have offices in different parts of the world, but there is a need to determine which is the most appropriate place to commence the insolvency proceedings. Now we must remember that insolvency proceeding is collective proceeding, and hence for efficient resolution, it is it is necessary that the insolvency collective or the main proceeding should only be commenced and be allowed to continue in only one jurisdiction. Otherwise, that would cause great complications and multiplicity of uh, issues. So the main principle is that center of main interest ideally is located in the place where the registered office of the company is located. And there are certain other aspects as well, notably the majority of the control of the company and also the majority of the creditors. So basis the registered office and also the operations and majority of creditors, considering all those aspects, the Dutch administrator agreed that yes, we agree that India is the place of the main proceeding, and we will, and that is why he wanted to participate in the committee of creditor meetings in India. So in case of JET, the main proceedings is being commenced in India, although we do not have any cross-border insolvency law, but still in Holland, in the Dutch court, no parallel insolvency proceeding is going on. So, an agreement was reached between the Dutch administrator and Indian resolution professional for cooperation in the overlapping insolvency proceedings, where the proceedings in India were accepted as the main insolvency proceedings. Second case, second case that I would want to take up is the insolvency case of Videocon Group. So, Videocon Group insolvency proceedings had commenced. Videocon Industries Limited had been engaged in the business of telecommunications, consumer and electronic goods, and oil and gas exploration through various overseas subsidiaries. Application moved by the chairman of the corporate debtor to allow consideration of the foreign assets of the corporate debtor in the insolvency proceedings in India. And another issue, whether the overseas assets of the CD can be seized for the purposes of the CIRP process in India. Well, even if we don't use the word seize, but the question that was before NCLT was whether the moratorium can be applicable or can be extended to the foreign assets of the corporate debtor. So this was the main issue which was decided this year itself. So NCLT Mumbai in this year, in its order, laid down certain parameters while ordering for the consolidation of Videocon Group companies. So consolidation order was passed previously, and the main reasons for ordering the consolidation, it was found that yes, this is the best situation to order consolidation of the Videocon Group. So first, there is a common control in all those entities, 13 group companies. So 13 companies were considered to be group companies so that procedural consolidation can continue. Second, common directors. Third, common assets. Fourth, common liabilities. There is a huge interlinking of assets, liabilities, management, then interdependence, interlacing of finance, pooling of resources, coexistence for survival, intricate link of subsidiaries, intertwined accounts, interlooping of debts, singleness of economic of units, and common financial creditors. Apart from that, there is also cross shareholdings. So, basis all of these aspects, the order of consolidation of 13 Videocon group companies was passed earlier by the Mumbai NCLT. Then later on in last year 2019, the MD of the previous MD of the Videocon group, Mr. Dhoot, he moved an application, and they wanted that the overseas companies be also be brought under the moratorium order, and they should also be put in the pool for the resolution process. And uh, the banks, the Indian banks, the Indian financial creditors, although they opposed because they thought that let's keep the foreign assets separate, because there is a possibility of selling them to investors, and that way at least they would get a good amount of money back, which was lent to those companies. So resolution professional was directed to include all foreign assets of the Videocon group for the purposes of imposition of the moratorium. So this year in 2020, the Mumbai NCLT passed this order and recognized that yes, the moratorium order imposed over the Videocon group shall also continue over the assets of the offshore assets of Videocon group, and the creditors, the Indian banks, they were prohibited from selling them separately, and they were also directed to be brought include to be included in uh, the procedural consolidation for resolution of the Videocon group. So yes, we know that what happened in so this was the earlier situation. Videocon was in the first list of the 12 largest accounts of the RBI that was referred for insolvency in 2016. And so if we see some of these factors and what are these companies, uh, so the initial order was for the consolidation, and we have already read the reasons and what are those companies. So basically, the valuable offshore assets, which were the oil and gas businesses. Uh, then there is was a gross. So what was the reason? Gross creation of security interest by all lenders in other business assets of Videocon Group, treating it as a single economic entity, and that we have concluded that the foreign oil and gas assets of the group held through the various group companies like VOVL, VHHL, VEBL, and VINI are in fact the assets and property of VIL. Therefore, the assets held by them can be said to be its assets, which is under the insolvency. VIL's overseas oil and gas companies are VOVL, Videocon Hydrocarbon Holdings, Videocon Energy Brazil, Videocon Indonesia, etc. The tribunal had also directed the resolution professional to include the assets, liabilities, claims of the above mentioned overseas assets in the information memorandum of Videocon. So the substantive consolidation had been ordered of the group companies, and it was included. Now, what is happening in India? So earlier this year in March 2020, the MCA committee to study ancestral model law on enterprise group insolvency. So the notification read that the scope of the work for the committee constituted to recommend rules and regulatory framework for the smooth implementation of cross-border insolvency provisions under the IBC got bigger. The MCA has now expanded the terms of reference of this panel, headed by retired IAS officer KP Krishnan, to cover aspects related to enterprise group insolvency on a cross-border basis. This committee, which was constituted in the third week of January in 2020, will now also study and analyze the ancestral model law for enterprise group insolvency and make recommendations in the context of the insolvency and the bankruptcy code. So this is very tried. The model law on cross-border insolvency was drafted and adopted in 1997, and in 2020 it's more than 20 years. uh, it's more than 20 years, and we are just deliberating whether to adopt the ancestral model on cross-border insolvency. But ancestral has gone ahead. They have also even drafted a model on enterprise group insolvency. So it is appropriate that as per the current needs, as per the current requirements, the scope be expanded, and the committee also consider whether the group insolvency model law may also be considered to be adopted in India. So now something about what is the ancestral model on cross-border insolvency. So it was adopted in 1997, and its purpose is to assist, is designed to assist the states to equip their insolvency law with a modern legal framework to more effectively address cross-border insolvency proceedings. So this is the model law, and this is like a legislation which is drafted by this body of UN, which is called as UNCITRAL, the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. And this is like a model law. The states may adopt it completely or they may make certain amendments. But the benefit is that if it is adopted in that manner by all the countries, then the jurisprudence, the decisions, and the principles that are evolved will be uniform. And in today's time, when we want to invite the foreign investors, they would want to be comfortable with the law, which has its basis as the international principles. So, if the international principles form the basis of this cross-border insolvency law that is adopted by India, it would give great confidence and boost to the FDI or to foreign investors to invest in India. And we have seen that IBC has been a great impetus to increase the uh, steps which India is taking on the ease of doing business. So India has climbed exponentially. In just 3 years, India was counted at around 150, and now it is just nearing rank number 50. So this is a great leap of great significance in these times, and good deal of it is depends upon the IBC, and there's a huge uh, relevance of the insolvency law to invite foreign capital, foreign expertise, and so on. So another purpose of the model law is concerning debtors experience severe financial distress or insolvency. It focuses on authorizing and encouraging cooperation and coordination between jurisdictions rather than attempting the unification of substantive insolvency law and respects the differences among national procedural laws. So it is not imposing any foreign law, and these laws are dependent upon certain principles which are not in contention or which can easily be adopted by a particular country. A cross-border insolvency is one where the insolvent debtor has assets in more than one state or where some of the creditors of the debtor are not from the state where the insolvency proceeding is taking place. So I I think I'll just continue. I am seeing that there was just one question. This is whether assets held abroad by directors in their personal names can be brought under net of cross-border insolvency. So, again, the question is that if the proceeding is against a particular company, then you have to trace the assets in the name of company. But if there are fraudulent transactions, and in India, it can be traced that the directors had siphoned off the assets. Certainly, you will have to prove, under the antecedent transactions, how and where the directors had taken the money, and if certain transactions, if some money has moved to the directors, then the directors may be uh, they may be the cases may be filed against them for recovery of that amount. As far as the property is
Sir,
concerned, well,
to this side, sorry for it. So your PPT is visible.
is not visible. Okay. Is it visible now?
Visible, sir.
Just a minute. is something else actually. Yeah. Is the PPT visible now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So, that most of it is concerned with asset tracing, and in the accounts, if you can trace the money where it has gone, certainly those assets can be traced. As far as the cross-border insolvency is concerned, it is a framework. Cross-border insolvency is a framework to promote cooperation and coordination amongst the courts. The law itself does not provide any particular provision that, like the question that you have asked, if the directors have taken recourse to, I mean, they have confiscated the money and they have built assets in an offshore place, and then you basically the rule that is applicable to the property is the law of that place will be applicable, but certainly you can trace the money which has gone into creating that property. And for that purpose, the cross-border insolvency law provides you a mechanism for cooperation and coordination. So I will just give you just a very good example, which I'm sure some of you must have faced. For example, in even in case of Videocon, or in case of some other maybe several assets, if the asset is in UAE, or if the asset is located in a country in Africa, like let's say Uganda, and the CIRP application has been admitted in India, so moratorium has been imposed. Now, if the insolvency professional goes to Uganda and tells the court that, this is a company and we have a moratorium and we want to take control of the assets, because it is the obligation of the insolvency professional to take the control and possession of the assets and ensure that the moratorium is applicable over them. You go to a foreign country, first challenge is this. So it is a latter challenge what will happen to the assets in the name of a director. But first challenge is, first try to catch hold of the assets, at least which are in the name of the company. So if there is no cross-border insolvency law, you cannot even take over control, and you cannot even issue a moratorium over the assets of a company which is in a foreign jurisdiction. So first challenge is this. So if Videocon, the challenge is, if in case of Videocon, if the moratorium order is issued, how they are going to enforce it in Brazil or in various jurisdictions. Like it has been seen in earlier cases, moratorium has been issued against a company. You go to Uganda, you go to UAE, and the courts will refuse. There is what is the basis for we recognizing the Indian courts insolvency orders of moratorium? There must be some mechanism or legal mechanism for recognition of such orders. So previously under CPC, there is a provision of section 44A, which ensures that there must be a recognition and enforcement of orders, but that is orders from a superior court on a reciprocal basis. But that is in civil matters. And ultimately, this is not satisfied in case of insolvency, because insolvency is not from a superior court and it is not from a final proceeding. It's not a final judgment. So those requirements are not met. Hence, first of all, we don't have even a mechanism where the insolvency moratorium order and the insolvency professional can take control of the named assets of the company in a foreign jurisdiction. So that is the first challenge that we need to overcome. So what are the key provisions and the principles that are there in case of the model law? So first is access. So access we provided to the representatives of foreign insolvency proceedings and creditors' rights to access the courts to seek assistance. Also to authorize representatives of local proceedings to seek assistance elsewhere. Then secondly, recognition, simplified procedures for recognition of qualifying foreign proceedings and appointing the foreign resolution insolvency professional. Effects: the relief accorded to relief assist the foreign proceedings. Third, relief: interim relief at the discretion of the court. Then stay, moratorium. Fourth, cooperation and coordination. The courts of states where the debtor's assets are located and coordination of concurrent proceedings. So these are the four basic principles which guide what you will find in the model of cross-border insolvency. So applicable, the court provides the adjudicating authority with the power to refusal to take any action for implementation which in its opinion ought to be manifestly contrary to the public policy of India. There is a question. If the company which is in UAE has obtained products from sole proprietor firm in India and defaulted in the payment which severely affected the business operations of the Indian firm, then whether IBC can be invoked by Indian firm in UAE. So, for the domestic resolution, you have to apply the domestic law. So in UAE, if you are approaching the UAE courts, then you can file insolvency application under the insolvency law of UAE only. So UAE court cannot apply the IBC. But because the UAE firm has purchased and has not paid the money. The seller is in India, so certainly seller can invoke IBC against the UAE company. But the question is, the company in case of civil matters, the defendant must be present within the territory of India. So how can you file the insolvency application in India? You are going to file the insolvency application in UAE because there is the company. In case the purchaser company office is in India, then only in India the insolvency application can be filed. But if the UAE company does not have any office in India, then you will have to go to UAE to file the insolvency proceedings. Okay, so again, thank you for these interesting questions. In case the creditor does not release encumbrance consequent to an approved resolution plan, what recourse is available to resolution applicant? Well, the question is that uh, I do appreciate, but these are hypothetical questions. Now, in whichever foreign country the creditor is located, they must have been made a party in the Indian courts. And the resolution, so the benefit of the cross-border insolvency is that the order of the court, is a final order, and this uh, can be sent for the recognition and enforcement in that country. So the problem of the problem of the first, that how this cooperation and coordination, that is the one country, that is India NCLT order, be sent to a foreign country, and why will their courts uh, seek to give credit to it? So whether they will recognize and enforce. There is a good possibility they should certainly recognize and enforce if we have a cross-border insolvency mechanism. So if there is a insolvency mechanism, then that recognizes that puts an obligation upon the courts to recognize and provide relief to and from the insolvency courts. This is a separate legal regime from the civil regime. So civil courts have the civil CPC, they have remedies under section 13, 14 and section 44A of CPC. Under IBC, currently we do not have any such provisions regarding offshore and cross-border proceedings. After the cross-border insolvency is adopted, at least we will have a mechanism to ensure the cooperation and coordination amongst the insolvency courts of various countries. So that is not should not be an issue, certainly. I do appreciate your questions. Right. So a foreign representative has to apply to the adjudicating authority. The foreign representative shall be bound to follow the code of conduct as may be notified. An application pursuant to this part is made to the adjudicating authority by a foreign representative does not subject the foreign representative or the foreign assets and affairs of the CD to the jurisdiction of courts in India or the adjudicating authority for any purpose than the application. And then penalty provisions for the foreign representatives when any loss of amount or unlawful gain on behalf of foreign representatives take place. So please continue with any questions that you have, and I will take up the questions. Well, India is not signatory to UNCITRAL, but the country in which assets are located is not a party. How resolution professional can take possession of the assets? Well, where there is a will, there is a way. There is no need for reciprocity, and reciprocity would be very detrimental if we adopt a reciprocal requirement because it would be really unworkable. Well, I don't want to answer this question. Oh, sir, thank you for your question, Mr. Madan. Looking at the experiences, do you think Indian judicial system is capable of well, so I really appreciate some of the great questions. Some question, uh, if you ask me, and I cannot say on behalf of the insolvency professionals because you are going to the courts and the insolvency lawyers, the great insolvency lawyers, they are arguing their cases. They are facing a lot of issues, and I have seen several of our colleagues arguing in making their points in several forums regarding issues in capacity development. But this is a nascent law, and I am optimistic that if the law is in place, certainly the people will also be able to implement it because it's not coming out of the stars, it's not coming out of the planet earth. Okay, so it is in India. We know these legal concepts. Basically these are all civil concepts. Only issue is that there might be a new law and there might be certain time for some people to get adopted to it. But I don't see any reason. Initial hiccups and initial gestation period is always there, and through these three years, through these four years that we have seen IBC in function, this has been a great gestation period. There has been a lot of battles inside the courtrooms and outside the courtrooms. Several amendments have been made. Several amendments have been forced, and I tell you one thing. Uh, every lawyer knows when we start reading that it is said common law is made by the judges, but in the civil matters, judges are actually deciding the law basis the arguments presented by the counsel. So two counsel are fighting, two counsel are presenting the best of issues and best of arguments, and the task of the judge becomes easy. They have to identify the best of the arguments and lay down that principle. So the law, in a way, is made through the arguments which are presented by the council. So I'm sure that with all this cooperation, there should not be an issue in the judges also, uh, you know, being able to adopt and apply these principles. Another question, we have seen that cooperation of police and cyber law enforcing authorities is very essential in CIRP proceedings. It is not necessary that cooperation of the foreign courts is necessary to enforce orders in foreign countries. So you are the question I apt. It is very right. Certainly the need is that uh, first of all, the foreign court should recognize and issue orders for enforcement, and then the law enforcement authorities, the police and other law enforcement authorities will take action, and they will initiate the uh, how the implementation is to go ahead. So there are technical aspects, but the first step is that there must be some mechanism where the courts to courts cooperation, the orders of one court can be at least presented in a court, and when the court asks whether we have any civil law or whether we have any law or we have any legal regime where I can be asked to consider the recognition and enforcement of a foreign insolvency order. So first step is this, and certainly the mechanisms are also there, and the mechanisms will also be prepared. So I'll continue with my presentation, and I do appreciate all your questions, and I do will continue to take these questions. So I'll just take, I think, two relevant cases so that I'm able to explain to you how some of the key principles of cross-border insolvency work. And then after that, I will certainly take more of your questions. The foreign proceedings again, foreign proceeding means a collective judicial or administrative proceeding in a foreign country. So the main purpose of insolvency proceeding is it is a collective proceeding. So all the creditors will come together and notice is issued so that all the claimants can also come together, all the assets are put into a pot, and then the resolution plan is prepared. The foreign representative means a person or body authorized in a foreign proceeding to administer the reorganization or the liquidation of the corporate debtors, assets or affairs, or to act as representative of the foreign proceeding, and includes any person uh, or body appointed on an interim basis. So the provisions shall apply only to the states who have adopted the ancestral model law on cross-border insolvency or on any other state specified in Part B of the schedule with the central government. So this is a scheme of the model law. First, general provisions, public policy clauses. Then second segment is access of foreign representatives and creditors to the adjudicating authority. Third, recognition of foreign proceeding and relief. Then fourth, cooperation with foreign courts and foreign representatives, concurrent proceedings, and miscellaneous. So in these six different type of segments or chapters, the insolvency, cross-border insolvency provisions are drafted. So now I take the case of Eurofood. Now Eurofood is a very interesting case. Now Europe, and we must be mindful that Eurofood case could be decided because it was a case of the European Union. In the European Union, the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, is the highest appellate authority which hears appeals or which hears cases amongst the states. We do not have any international court in civil matters. There is International Court of Justice which decides issues of countries, of states, not individuals. So there is no civil international court. But in Europe, there is the civil matters for individuals, the European Court of Justice. So this case was that there was this company Eurofood. Eurofood was registered in Ireland. Its promoter or the holding company was Parmalat, which was Italian company. The board of directors of Eurofood were basically having its control center, or they used generally sit and have meetings in Italy. But Eurofood was constituted as a financial is basically SPV to fund the operations of the parent company Parmalat in certain South American countries. So this was the modus operandi. Eurofood was SPV. It was created in a tax haven Ireland to take benefit of the tax aspects. There it took loans from banks, American Express and several banks, British banks, American banks, and it used that money to fund its operation in South America. Parent company was Parmalat in Italy. So now when the business suffered, the business in South America suffered, business of Eurofood suffered, business of Parmalat suffered, Eurofood defaulted in its obligations, and because Eurofood was going under a stress, then the parent company Parmalat moved an insolvency application in the court of Italy to seek administration. So it was a application which was moved in the courts of Italy to seek a administration over the assets of the Eurofood company. So at that time, it was mentioned as a temporary administrative or interim administrative relief. Subsequent to it, in Ireland, the bankers, the creditors, moved insolvency application. So they moved the insolvency application, and the insolvency application was admitted in Dublin. Before that, the Italian court had also granted the order of temporary or interim administration to the Italian uh, parent company Parmalat. So now what happens? The Italian company Parmalat takes this order to Ireland, and they say that we have an insolvency order and we want to enforce it. So that would have meant that the assets of Eurofood in Italy would come under the control of the administrator, which was appointed by the Italian court. But basically, it was Parmalat which was given the rights to administer the assets of Eurofood only. Whereas in Ireland, it were the creditors. Creditors took the administration. It was insolvency application, and they moved application in Italy and elsewhere in Europe, wherever the assets of Eurofood were situated. So that there was a conflict which court's order would be enforced, whether Italian court insolvency is appropriate or the Irish court insolvency is appropriate. So there was a conflict. As we have seen in case of Jet, the Dutch administrator felt that no, the situation is that in India is the best place and India is the main proceeding, so we will not continue the main proceedings in Netherlands. However, in this case, both wanted to continue the insolvency proceedings. Ultimately, the matter went to the ECJ, and ECJ had to decide. Now, the question is that this question depends upon the center of main interests, which is the place where the center of main interests is located, and only in that place will the main proceedings will be considered to be constituted. So only at the place of the COMI, the main interest, the main proceedings can continue, and only in that place the resolution plan for that company can be negotiated. Now, what were the reasons? Well, so initially the Dublin High Court found that Eurofoods COMI was located in Ireland because its registered office was located there, and it appeared to the third party creditors that its COMI was located in Ireland. And the court further held that Irish main proceeding had opened on 27 January when it had appointed the temporary liquidator. Uh, but But in February 20, the Parma court at Italy opened a main insolvency proceeding for Eurofood. Now the question is which of these would be valid. Now the theory is how to identify the COMI, whether it is a place of registered office or some other place, where the debtor is a subsidiary company whose registered office and that of its parent company are situated in two different member states. the presumption can be rebutted only if factors which are both objective and ascertainable by third parties enable it to be established that an actual situation exists, which is different from that which location as that registered office is deemed to reflect. So the default rule is COMI is at the place of registered office. However, this is a rebuttable presumption. So the presumption of COMI is that generally COMI or the center of main interest will be at a place which is the registered office of the company. However, this is not a conclusive factor, this is a rebuttable presumption. And this rebuttable presumption can be rebutted on certain other grounds. The main grounds are that the control, effective control, is in some other countries. And the main cases in which this rebuttable presumption is applied is in case of shell companies, where like Cayman Islands, or where they just the shell office is there, whereas office the main assets and the main business is located in some other country. So in several cross-border insolvency proceedings between the Cayman Islands companies and the US, so US in the US, their main business is located, whereas in the Cayman Islands, their registered office is located. The US courts refuse, and even the Cayman Islands courts, they refuse to consider that the Cayman Islands is a COMI, because effectively the entire assets and the control is in the United States. So for wherever there is a shell company, the registered office approach does not apply. Second rule is rule of priority. So in case let's say there is a case in same company has an office in Australia, is a branch office in Australia. The company has a branch office in US. The company might be registered in England, but substantive business is going on in US. It is a branch office. Substantive business is going on in Australia. So how to determine? So if insolvency application is filed in Australia and insolvency application is filed in US, generally the rule of priority will be applicable. That is, which insolvency application was filed prior in time. So in case the insolvency application was filed prior in time in Australia, and this is made known to the US court, it is likely that the court in whose jurisdiction uh, the insolvency application was filed later in time will consider the rule of priority and will recognize the earlier jurisdiction as the jurisdiction of main proceeding, considering all the other aspects are in balance. So the rule of priority is also applicable. Now the rule of priority went in favor of, seems to be going in favor of the Italian court, but the rule here again, when the parties looked in the Italian court, the proceeding which was filed was not insolvency proceeding. It was a temporary administrative order, and a temporary or an interim administrative order does not amount to insolvency proceeding. So hence it was found that prior in time, no insolvency proceeding had commenced in Italy. Whatever proceeding had commenced in Italy prior in time, it could not be called as insolvency proceeding. It was only interim or a temporary administrative uh, order. Then there were some questions for the ECJ. As I have mentioned, first, what is the insolvency proceeding? So what is the definition of insolvency proceeding? Where you can distinguish between the insolvency application filed for resolution or an application filed for interim or a temporary administratorship of certain assets. So these type of applications are recognized in certain insolvency laws in certain jurisdictions, but it is not under IBC. What are the governing factors for determining center of main interest when registered office of a parent company and its subsidiary are located in different member states? And whether a member state had to give recognition to a decision of another member state purporting to open insolvency proceedings in respect of a debtor when that debtor had not been given the right to fair procedures and a fair hearing. So, the European Court of Justice gave its decision based upon two factors. First set of factors is the location where debtor regularly administered its own interests as ascertainable by third parties and the country in which it is incorporated. So what it means is that because the bankers gave loan to Eurofood in Ireland and the loan agreements were signed in Ireland. So this is a major factor that this is discernible to the third parties, which are the creditors, and this is a strong factor which goes on to determine the center of main interest of the business activities of a particular company. The second set of factors arises from the location of the parent company, which by virtue of its ownership and power to appoint directors is able to control the policy decisions of the subsidiary. Now, in case of Eurofood, these factors point to different countries for the location. Now, the court must determine the relative weight given to each factor, and the criteria is required to be both objective and ascertainable by third parties, typically the debtor's major creditors. So, in the Eurofood proceeding, third parties may have undertaken considerable effort in exercising due diligence to assure themselves as to the location of the debtor's coin. So, in case of Eurofood, the loan was given in Ireland, the registered office was in Ireland, and in their agreements, they must have put clauses which ensured that in case of any doubt, in case of any dispute, the proceedings will be brought only in Ireland. So, the lenders must have in their loan agreements that in case of any dispute, the proceedings will be brought in the courts of Ireland. So these factors, so that is why what is required is the weight that is required to be provided. So the weight that was given to in the case of Eurofood was that lenders, the bankers, creditors gave loan in Ireland, and this was the determining factor why Ireland would be considered as the center of main interest, and the insolvency proceeding in Ireland was ordered to continue, and the proceeding in Ireland was ordered to be abated. So the presumption that Eurofood Comi was located in Ireland because its registered office was located there was supported by the evidence of the expectations of its major creditors. So there is another case, and let me see if we have some more cases, questions. Okay, right. So I'll take some of these questions after I have taken this case. Now, an interesting case, the head office function, Daisy Tech, defaulted on financial covenants, and this default caused financial problems for the subsidiaries in Europe. There were several subsidiaries in Europe. Consequently, insolvency proceedings were filed in US, England, Germany, and France. In light of the case, the English court was satisfied that the commie of each company in the group was situated in England, specifically in Bradford. Why? Because it was argued that the head office in Bradford was the coordinator and the performer of the European Union, which included, for example, the negotiation of supply contracts. So, in uh, the de facto the de facto head office function was being performed by this office in Bradford, England, which was negotiating, entering into contracts on behalf of all the other European subsidiary companies. So we read of another principle, the head office function approach, even though it is not The registered office, even though it is not the place where the directors are sitting, it is not the nerve center, but it is a place where the head office function is being coordinated. So now, in this case, the court placed a particular emphasis on the claim that the center of the debtor's mean interest was ascertainable by the third parties. And from the point of view of the English court, the third parties are the creditors. So, in the case of a trading company, these creditors are most likely to be its trade suppliers and its financiers. Right. So, I have one more case. Uh, Do we break for some questions or can I continue with this case for 10 more minutes, 10, 15 more minutes?
So we can continue with the session and we can have the question and answer round in the end, sir.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So this is an interesting case. It is not entirely of insolvency, but this is basically a cross-border litigation. Cross-border litigation, there is execution, there is a dispute, and how the insolvency law of Singapore was tried to be used, that is, the moratorium was tried to be used to scuttle the cross-border litigation or the execution process. So the case was that this Sumikin Busan International was the creditor company, and it was basically of Hong Kong, and King Shing Enterprises was a company which was basically operated by two people of Indian origin. The name was Manohar Trikamdas Modi. So in Hong Kong there was a dispute, and initially in the Hong Kong court, judgment was passed against King Shing Enterprises. The owners, promoters were Manohar Trikamdas, and they were resident of Singapore, and they had certain properties in India. So when the case judgment was given against Kingshing Enterprises and in Manharlal Trikamdas, the Sumikin Busan Company of Hong Kong, they went to execute it in wherever the assets of the company and the debtors are located. They were located, it was a civil case, so they were taking recourse to the uh, civil proceedings, the civil procedure which is in existence. So they went against the debtors' asset in Singapore and they went against the debtors' assets in India. So now what happened in India? Initially, uh, it was sought that Section 44A was tried to be, you know, taken recourse to, and it was argued by the Sumikin Busan company that we have a final order of a court and we want to come for the direct enforcement and recognition in India under Section 44A of the CPC. So initial argument was that the Hong Kong SAR is not a reciprocating territory within the Section 44A of the CPC, and also it was not a superior court notified under Section 44A of the CPC. So initially this was the case, but and the judgment was that yes, uh, Hong Kong SAR is not a notified territory, it is not a superior court, and hence the direct execution proceedings and provisions of Section 44A will not be applicable. Then they filed the regular suit, which was as per Section 13 and 14 of the CPC. So it continued, and in that suit, the court recognized that yes, this order is valid and attached the property of the debtors. Through this time, uh, as we know that proceedings had also been initiated by Sumikin Busan in Singapore against Manohar Trikamdas and Kingsing Enterprises. In Singapore, Manohar Trikamdas filed insolvency application and filed that, I am insolvent and I want to go into the insolvency process. I don't have the money to pay. So the Singapore court ordered insolvency and ordered, so there is a insolvency order where there is moratorium and in a way it operates like a bankruptcy protection order that the assets will not be sold. So when Manohar Trikamdas got insolvency order from Singapore, now he wanted to get it enforced and recognized in India so that the execution of his Maharashtra Pune property, which was already attached, be stayed. So interestingly, they tried to utilize the foreign insolvency law stay provision to get it enforced in India so that the execution proceeding, which had already, been taken, had already been, allowed, ordered, be stayed. So the court ordered that so what is prior in time, right? So the question is whether the order of execution in India where the property was attached, was it prior in time or whether it was subsequent to the insolvency order granted by the Singapore court. Although they did not elaborately go into the question whether the Singapore insolvency court orders would be recognized and enforced in India, which my view is it cannot be because the insolvency order is different from a civil court order. But still, it was not considered in the High Court whether the insolvency order of the Singapore court can be recognized and enforced in India. So the decision was given on the basis of the execution proceeding, which was ordered in India. It was prior in time, and the insolvency which was ordered in Singapore was later in time, and it was being used just as a forum shopping to, uh, you know, avoid the execution orders in India. uh, so this is an interesting case through which we can understand how the cross. I'm sure some of you might have witnessed some of these cases, but this is a very interesting case that I found, which I wanted to refer to you to understand or refer the cross-border litigation proceedings, which include execution and which also include the operation of insolvency law. So in India, initially recommended by the Justice Iradi Committee and the Professor Anil Mitra Advisory Group on Bankruptcy Laws, they provided suggestion was cross-border insolvency law and suggested a comprehensive cross-border law, including the separate insolvency law in India. So in 2001, the RBI committee gave a draft insolvency law of India, and it also contained a chapter on the cross-border insolvency. But that was as early as in 2001. And initially, there was a case in 1962, Raja of Vizianagaram versus official liquidator. And this case was probably considered to be an earlier case or an example of a cross-border insolvency proceeding in India. So what happened was that there was a company which was incorporated outside India in Britain, and whether it may be wound up as an unregistered company, when it ceases to carry on business in India, and whether the foreign creditors can be allowed to participate in the liquidation proceedings in India. So the court held that foreign creditors are no different from Indian creditors. Foreign creditors can also lay their claim into the assets, and there is no such public policy in which the foreign creditors' claims can be excluded. So it is even if a foreign company which is incorporated in UK, the provisions are there in the Companies Act that such foreign company may be liquidated, may be wound up as an unregistered company in India. So when such a company is wound up, uh, the right of the foreign creditors to participate in the liquidation proceedings cannot be denied. So this was a very progressive judgment at that time. So cross-border insolvency, the way ahead, UNCITRAL model on cross-border insolvency, and so these were the only two provisions um, in the IBC, section 234 and section 235. But these were unworkable, and it was just thought that instead of operationalizing these provisions, we just wait for the time when we can bring out a comprehensive cross-border insolvency law in India. And I believe the time has come where we should have a separate cross-border insolvency law in India. All right, thank you for your time and consideration. So let's open for some Q&A. Some questions are here, right? Is there any mechanism in international trade law for agreements to be reached between courts of different countries on implementation of legal proceedings? So, I will, so generally in cases like the best example that I can provide to you is the arbitration, the international. So we have the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996, and in case of international arbitration awards, there is a New York Convention, which is for the recognition and enforcement of foreign arbitration awards. So whenever there is a foreign arbitration, according to the norms of that convention, so the governing law in that case is the New York Convention for the enforcement and recognition of foreign arbitration awards. That is for arbitration. So accordingly, foreign arbitration awards can be enforced, recognized and enforced in a company in a country where the creditor wants. So wherever the debtor's assets are located, it can be enforced at that place. Now, as far as the civil proceedings go, in case of civil proceedings, there is as yet no such international law. There is no such international convention, although there are discussion. There are draft instruments which are under draft, and which is basically for recognition and enforcement of foreign civil judgments. As of now, the civil judgments, as we have seen in the case of section 44A of the CPC, they are based upon the court, upon the agreements which are entered into between the countries. So the country enters into agreements, they may be basically bilateral agreements. On the basis of the bilateral agreements in India, we have recognized on the basis of the reciprocity. However, even if there is no reciprocity, then under section 13 and 14 of the CPC, any foreign judgment or order can be registered in the Indian domestic court, and then the proceedings can continue for its recognition and enforcement. That's a long time taken process. So I believe that is the answer to your question. There is currently no mechanism in international trade law for agreement to be reached between courts of different countries on implementation of legal proceedings. For arbitration, there is the New York Convention. In case of insolvency, the model law of cross-border insolvency, it promotes court-to-court cooperation. So the model law on cross-border insolvency promotes court-to-court cooperation, and which is efficient. And there is another system which is called as the JIN, the Judicial Insolvency Network, which promotes or which provides some sort of a coordination between the judges. The best example is the comfort level of the judges. The best example is judges between US and Canada. The timeline is the same. They are in the same time zones, and it has been seen that in case of insolvency, which is on the same matter, the judges, they just call on the phone and they talk, and that is the level of cooperation that has been conducted between the US and Canada insolvency courts. But these were basically certainly administered through the cooperation between the courts and certain mechanism. Similar cooperation is also there between the courts of insolvency courts of UK and USA. But there is no mechanism in international trade law, if you want to ask that question. Another question is, a creditor in India wants to take insolvency proceeding against a defaulting company in US. Is it now possible to do under Chapter 15 of US Insolvency Act? So Chapter 15 recognizes the cross-border insolvency. So this is basically for the recognizing the cross-border insolvency. So this basically is that the creditor and the debtor both have their place in India, and the debtor has substantive assets in US. So we want to bring a broader cross-border insolvency case. And in case the resolution process is already undergoing in India, then today we do not have the model law on cross-border insolvency. Today we do not have a cross-border insolvency legal regime. So we do not have any claim that we can file a Chapter 15 application in US because our legal regime does not recognize cross-border insolvency. So if so, so we need a cross-border insolvency regime for the other country to recognize this as a cross-border insolvency case. Okay, so any other questions? I think let me have a look at other questions that we receive. In case there are no bilateral agreements between India and other countries, well, then if there is no bilateral agreement, then it is actually left to the uh, will of the court. So the court has a discretion, and it may refuse. It may refuse to recognize. So if there is no agreement, if there is no bilateral or there is no multilateral agreement, then we have seen cases, and I'm sure you must have also seen cases where the foreign courts have refused. So I think there are so this is also very, I mean, interesting question, how to get into cross-border insolvency practice. Is there any membership with any international institutes to be taken to handle such cases? Are there any exams or training sessions? Uh, there is a minor percentage of cases which involve cross-border insolvency. So even if we take the example of UK, apparently even less than 5% of the total insolvency cases in UK have a relation to cross-border insolvency. Similarly, in India also, I think it should not be more than 5%, but that should not deter anyone from entering into the cross-border insolvency practice. This is basically your interest in the cases, and international institutions. I'm sure there are international institutions, professional institutions. Uh, I would not want to name any such professional organization, but there are several professional organizations who organize such specialist training sessions for cross-border insolvency, and you could search online. But if uh, if you want, you're most welcome to contact me or write to me, and individually I can suggest what are the international institutions where you can get such specialist training or advice. But as I said, that presently in India, the cross-border insolvency matters are less in number and less in percentage. It will certainly take some time for them to take up. So I hope this was comfortable. Contact details, yes, certainly. I think that is not a problem. You can have my contact details. You can write to me, most welcome. So you are most welcome. So you can, write to me. And is there any other questions? I think there are no other questions now. Radhika?
Sir,
Yes, sir.
Manvi
Yes,
this
sir.
side. Thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful session, sir. On behalf of Team ICSI IIP, I would like to extend our gratitude for taking up this session and sharing your expertise and knowledge upon the same, sir.
I thank you. I thank ICSI IIP for inviting me, and my best wishes to all of you. And I really thank all of the participants to uh, find the time to listen to me. And I do hope that this session was informative to you. I thank one and all for thank you for encouraging remarks and comments from some of the great lawyers also who have been. I really appreciate some of our esteemed colleagues. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. We look forward to such more session of yours, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.